Good afternoon, everybody. Want to welcome you to the webinar today, Scaling Test-First Methodology for the Enterprise, featuring Kevin Dunne. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to quickly go through a couple slides and then hand it over to Kevin for the presentation. Just a little bit. So this webinar is brought to you by QASymphony. For many of you out there, you are current customers and you know us. For those who don't, we are the developers of a testing platform that's purpose-built for agile teams. So if you want more information on QASymphony, please go check out our website, QASymphony.com. I'll also encourage you to check out our blog. If you like content like you're going to see today, we have a ton of content on our blog that we share, and we update really on a daily basis. So I'd encourage you to use that as a resource as a software tester. Really good content there. I also want to tell you about two upcoming webinars. I imagine since you're on this webinar, you may be interested in participating in some future webinars as well. Two really great webinars we have coming up. Relieving the testing bottleneck in your projects. That's coming up on Thursday, March 3rd. And using JIRA for test case management is coming up on March 9th. So those are two great webinars to check out. And actually, in the interface here, you'll see on the upper right, there is a little module there, and in that module, you're able to click on either of those webinars if you want to just register right now. So definitely check those webinars out. I think they're going to be great. Another program I wanted to let you know about, we are having a conference in Atlanta, Georgia on April 13th. The conference is called Quality Jam, dedicated to software testing and software quality. We have some great speakers coming in. You could learn more about Quality Jam at qualityjam.com, and there's a discount code right here on the screen, QASVIP, if you're interested in attending Quality Jam. I want to tell you we do have early bird pricing for Quality Jam right now. It's $100 for a one-day event, and you can get an additional $20 off with the QASVIP code. But for those attending this webinar, if you want to send an email to qualityjam@QASymphony.com and just tell us you're interested in attending, the first 5 emails we get, we will give you a complimentary pass to the event. So we hope you can join us for that, and we'd love to see you in Atlanta in April. So a couple housekeeping items before we get started with the webinar. This will be recorded and on demand next week, so if you have to drop out halfway through, don't worry. We're recording it, and you'll be able to watch it again, or you could share it with colleagues. If you have a question, you'll see in the lower left of the screen there is a Q&A module. And so, I encourage you to use that module, answer any questions. We already have some questions coming through already. So, please ask any questions of the presenter. If you have technical questions, we could take care of you there too. So feel free to use that module. We'll get to as many questions as we can by the end of the webinar. We are going to be live tweeting during the webinar. So if you're a Twitter user, definitely join the conversation using the hashtag Test-First. And also you'll see in the screen there's a little Twitter module right there in the lower right, and so you can use that. That's a really easy way to tweet right from the webinar. And I'd ask at the end of the webinar, we're going to serve you up with a short survey. So please take that survey and help give us feedback on the webinar, what you like, what you didn't like, so we can improve for next time. So with that, I want to hand it over to our presenter today, Kevin Dunne. He is the VP of Strategy and Business Development at QASymphony. Kevin is one of the original team members here at QASymphony. He's worked in almost every single facet of the company, from customer support, marketing, product. Prior to QASymphony, he was with Deloitte, and he holds a BS from Vanderbilt University. So with that, Kevin, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Jeff. I'm really eager to talk to you guys today about this particular topic. This is a newer one for us and just for the testing community in general, and that's really these test-first methodologies. So just to give you guys a little bit of an overview here, time-wise, we do hope to keep about the last 15 minutes for Q&A. So what we're going to take you through today is a brief overview of what TDD is, since I know for a lot of you guys this will be new, talking about these test-driven development methodologies. The second thing that we're going to talk about is the benefits of these test-driven methodologies, why you would want to use them, how it will benefit you and your organization, and also some things that you should be aware of in terms of potential pitfalls and people who may not be a good fit today for test-driven development. And then finally, we'll talk about how to implement this process. So how can you prepare the people on your team? How can you improve your process and get it ready to make this switch? And then also, obviously, we'll talk about tools. A lot of the focus is around tools when making a shift to this type of process, but we won't cover that in a ton of depth, but we will go into it somewhat. But first of all, we wanted to push you guys out a poll and get a general sort of temperature on what you guys know about this particular topic. So some of you guys might be experts, some of you guys might be brand new to this topic, and we've got a question here where we're just trying to gauge whether or not you're brand new to this or you're an expert. So from kind of the top down to the bottom is, gaining more and more experience in this particular field. So take a second here and let us know what your level of knowledge in this subject matter is, and then we can kind of tune the presentation accordingly. So we'll give everyone about 10 more seconds to make their choice here. And don't worry, we're not going to publish this out on Twitter or anything. So be honest, if you are hearing about this for the first time, this is definitely a new topic here. So there's no shame to be had if this is your first time getting some exposure to this. All right, so we just pushed out the results here. It looks like the most popular, about half the people in here have heard of it but never used the methodology, and then we've got about half here who are looking to experiment with this particular methodology, starting some early usage of it, so that's great. And then there are some people who have never really even heard of this, and they're looking to learn about this today. It seems like we have one expert potentially out there, so I'll make sure not to anger that person, hopefully not say anything that will get me in hot water there. So we'll make sure to kind of keep it very much so educational. I think the level of the presentation will be good for those of you who are just starting to work with this methodology. It should hopefully be right in your wheelhouse. So we'll make sure to tune this accordingly. So the first part that we're going to jump into here is really talking about what TDD is. So TDD stands for test-driven development. But before we get into really talking about what TDD is, TDD was obviously something that was brought to the forefront to solve the current problems that people are experiencing in their software development. So we really want to do a little bit of a look back in history about really where we've come from and why we experience some of the problems today that we're looking to solve with TDD. So, historically, we really came from these sort of waterfall or rational unified process type of approaches here, which in many ways were not iterative, right? They're much more so long-scale type of approaches where these processes run a lot in series here. So you can see based off this diagram that, business modeling and requirements would happen first. Then we get into, more of an implementation phase where we're doing periods of testing, all leading up to a huge deployment at the end. And so if any one of these particular parts of the process runs over, it typically will extend the development cycle, which will mean either pushing out release dates or potentially squeezing down the time that we can perform activities like testing and deployment and things like that, which obviously brings a lot of risk into what we're doing development-wise. So all that being said, obviously, it's not that we've gotten really much smarter about how we're doing software development today. I mean, that's certainly one aspect of it, but, there were a number of other reasons why this process was implemented in the way that it was, right? So it was very difficult, back even 5 or 10 years ago to create environments. Creating a testing environment would take a lot of time. You'd have to go through a lot of red tape to do that. certainly people were a lot less advanced in the way of how they merge code and bring code together, so a lot more use of things like Subversion, whereas the market has moved a lot towards things like GitHub and Bitbucket and other tools to manage that today. We lived in an on-premise world, so we had to do a lot to actually set up machines. We'd actually work through procurement to buy servers to run code on and set up test environments, so that obviously took a lot of time and needed a lot of advanced planning. A lot of focus on desktop applications, so obviously things like Microsoft Word, for example, they would have their one big release every 1 or 2 years, so it was okay to really work in that type of more RUP or waterfall model. A lot of lack of collaboration, that was not the case in every organization, but certainly have seen a lot of organizations in the past where people didn't really have much collaboration between test and development. And then finally, a lot of offshore development and working in offshore teams. It obviously can be a benefit to really plan ahead and have a long-term plan about what's being developed so that the communication can be smooth between both onshore and offshore, especially before we had a lot of the good, sort of chat and productivity tools that we have today to help manage around that. So there's been a shift, in my opinion, in the last, 5 to 10 years, there's been a big shift in tooling and in processes. Around environment creation, we've got containers, making that process very smooth and efficient to create new test environments. Code merges have been managed, again, by Git, replacing Subversion for the most part in newer organizations. We're moving towards the cloud, making it very easy to set up servers to run our particular apps, and then also making it very easy for us to push updates out on those particular apps. Moving away from purely a desktop focus to mobile and web and things that have very frequent release cycles and the ability to apply patches and updates in real time, and then more collaboration. Obviously, that's just a cultural thing in organizations. We put a lot more emphasis on collaboration, and a lot more development is moving back onshore. And where it's not, we do have these great tools and chat tools to really help out with that. So we've removed a lot of the barriers there and allowed for something like TDD to be a reality, whereas previously it would be much more difficult. So this is really what we're talking about when we talk about a test-first approach versus a traditional approach. So in a traditional approach, to tie back into the diagram we were showing around how the RUP process works, we would go through a design phase, then we would typically go through a long requirements phase where we might be working with a client or a customer to define what the software should do. Then we would write code against those particular requirements, after which we would do some testing. We might do some of the creation of those test cases or the planning of those test cases while the code is being written, and then we would go through a long process of actually deploying the code out into production. So test-first approach is different. Now that we've freed ourselves from some past limitations here, we can adopt a new type of methodology where basically we design the software and we actually first create an automated test. So what we really do is remove this long requirements definition phase, and instead of defining requirements that are then translated into manual or automated tests, instead we use some of these tools like Cucumber and others that have been very popular in the market to actually write the automated test up front. So the automated test really serves in many ways as the functional requirement to which code is written against that particular test. And then as soon as the code can actually pass the test, we move into a process of refactoring that code where the code can be changed in the way that it operates, in the way that the solution is created without breaking the actual functionality of that code. And then finally, we move into a deployment process, which today is typically a lot more frequent and a lot shorter in duration than our past deployment processes, since we have a lot better tooling and automation around that today. So that's really where the process, is adapting to, and what these sort of test-first approaches are supporting. And really, there's a sort of a hierarchy of these test-driven approaches. TDD is really sort of a blanket or an umbrella of a family of different processes, which we typically see as being BDD, which is behavior-driven development, typically leaning on tools like Cucumber and others in JBehave to perform that. There's acceptance test-driven development, which is really a very similar thing to BDD. Some people have said that BDD is really just ATDD done well. So those are two very similar processes, typically just differing in sort of the tools and maybe slightly the way that the features and specifications are defined. And then finally, there's more of a unit test-driven development, which is really more of a technical process where we're actually writing unit tests in something like JUnit, and it's typically the developer performing that activity. And that process is in a very similar type of cadence to how acceptance test-driven development and behavior-driven development operate, but it's much more at a technical level, so the tests that are being written aren't typically as readable for the business, which is not a problem when you're a small, very development-oriented company, but it can become a problem when you become a larger company with more of a business presence and you have to create requirements that are more readable to the end users. So this is sort of the hierarchy here of how we see it. Again, there aren't really many good definitions of what really would make ATDD and BDD different, but the best one that I saw here was this one I found online from Wes Williams saying that, basically the same goals for BDD as for ATDD. It's just that BDD is very much so strict about using the given, when, then language, whereas acceptance test-driven development might be more flexible around that. So I don't really want to get caught up in sort of what the two differences are, between ATDD and BDD. They're generally a very similar approach, and we'll come back to really where they differ when we get into speaking more around the tooling here. Finally, I did want to discuss a little bit here while in this section sort of the pros and cons of an ATDD or a BDD approach. So we are really focusing more on basically the difference between those two approaches versus more of a unit or technical TDD approach. So BDD and ATDD will get a better understanding of tests, so these are more readable tests that a business stakeholder could look at and understand what's happening, and that's because we're using the given, when, then language. Typically a TDD test would be more at sort of a code level and more difficult for someone like a business analyst to read. It does foster more collaboration because it's typically an approach that BAs and more manual testers and developers can all take part in, whereas a unit testing approach might be something that really only developers spend much time doing, so it doesn't drive as much collaboration. Another benefit of these ATDD and BDD approaches is focus on more of the customer needs rather than the technical needs, so it makes you really think about how the customer will use the solution up front, especially in acceptance test-driven development. I think that's the case. And then finally, there's a higher involvement from the business in how we sort of develop our software and how we emphasize quality. But there are some drawbacks. Typically it's an additional tool to do ATDD or BDD, although that's not always the case. It can be done with things today that are sort of helping to bridge the gap between units and more business side testing. There's more time being spent. You're giving it more thought up front than if you just have a developer go out and define a unit test, because you have more people sitting in the room typically being a part of that process, so that can be an additional cost. And then there's also, kind of stronger demands on how the members of your requirements team, your development team, and sort of your testing team would be involved in the process. So they have to be very much so willing to collaborate and spend time up front, which can be difficult in some organizations. And then finally, doing something like ATDD or BDD, a lot of times that means dedicated resources that are knowledgeable around Cucumber, JBehave, whatever it might be that you're using. And so that might require you to have to make some new hires that have core competencies in that area. So that's sort of our high-level overview of what TDD is and kind of the 10-minute background there from my view and our view. I do want to push this out. So this is another question here. It's a little bit related to the last question that we asked. And what we're asking here is, if you do follow a TDD approach, are you doing more of the unit test-driven development that's using something like JUnit, or something like NUnit, for example, where the developer is driving that? Are you doing an acceptance test-driven development or behavior-driven development approach? And if you're doing something where you can't tell the difference, either one of those is fine. Just pick whichever one that you feel is the closest to what you're doing and the tools that you're using. And then if you're not doing any of these three approaches, I know almost half the people said that they're not yet experimenting with this. We'd love to know, are you agile and trying to make the push from another agile methodology, say, kind of a Scrum methodology where you're writing user stories and acceptance criteria, or are you making the jump here from something like Waterfall where you're doing more of that rough process that was defined on the first slide there? So give you a few seconds here to go ahead and answer that.
Hey, Kevin, while they're answering that question, I got a question from the audience that I thought maybe you could answer quickly.
Yeah.
Is there any similarity between TDD and DDT, data-driven testing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially behavior-driven development, in those frameworks, particularly those are the ones I'm most familiar with, you can always, use kind of like scenario outline format and some other things, not to get too technical or in the weeds, that can really allow you to do testing based off of particular data that you want to validate inside of your scenarios. So I think there's a lot of different overlap here, and test-driven development is really not something that would get in the way or be at any way at odds with doing something like Scrum or Kanban. It's really just defining the way in which you model your software and the way that you design your software. And typically TDD is paired with, sometimes DevOps continuous integration approaches, as well as Scrum and Kanban, and I certainly think data-driven testing could be paired with TDD as well. So let's see what we got here. So most people are doing Agile, which is great. So we do see that this is, are you guys able to see? Okay, so yeah, now we can see that most people here, far and away, are kind of doing an Agile requirements-driven approach, not yet doing a test-driven approach. So that's good. I mean, really switching from Agile while you're still managing requirements, at least, kind of in that Scrum or Kanban type cadence, and potentially doing some sort of continuous deployment, continuous development as a good basis to make what I think is the next step to doing one of these test-driven development approaches. And it does look like some people are already doing BDD, ATDD, and some unit testing type of test-driven development as well. So that's great. And for the people that are doing Waterfall, you may want to consider, kind of trying to get your process in order from the cadence in which you hold meetings and kind of define expectations and timelines and all of that by shifting to an Agile requirements-driven methodology first, and then looking to implement TDD on top of that. But there are certainly organizations that we've seen that have gone straight from a more Waterfall requirements-driven approach directly into something like TDD. Just take some good planning and foresight on that. So we'll talk here a little bit about the benefits of TDD. So this is really talking about why you would want to do TDD and sort of what benefits you think that would bring to your organization in making this shift. Obviously, it's not easy. It's not something that you can do overnight. It will, and many times in large organizations, take many sprints and kind of have to be piloted in different small teams and rolled out across the organization. But we think that the benefits are really large. And we've really watered it down here, a little bit. There's a ton of benefits in terms of, test-driven development and what that can bring to your organization. But I think four of the big ones that we see as the big drivers are first, making testing be upfront in the process, so we're not constantly rushing that and squeezing our testing out the back end of the development process, which is obviously going to cause more bugs and more uncertainty about the coverage that you might have. Bringing in automation early on keeps us from getting in the problem that we see a lot of organizations being in today, which is that they always were going to get around to automation, but they didn't have time, and they cut corners potentially and run manual tests where they might not want to. And then they end up sort of building up that technical debt of having to bake in automation later on. And it becomes harder and harder as you sort of forget how the application might be architected, especially to hook in code at the unit testing level. It really does make sense to do a lot of that from day one. Your software ultimately should become more testable. A lot of times people are trying to test software that's kind of like a black box, and so the only way that we can do testing is to either do manual testing or to do more of a automated UI type of testing, which is obviously more brittle and runs more slowly. So when you force something like BDD or especially TDD onto your teams, what it does is forces them to kind of re-architect the application in ways that make it a lot more testable and make it easier to write a variety of tests beyond just those UI tests, which may not be the best solution overall for doing a sort of BDD or ATDD process. And then finally, we'll talk about how this approach of doing a test-driven development approach will allow you to push software to customers just in time as soon as you're done developing it, assuming that you have sort of the back end of this process figured out, which is how to do some sort of DevOps approach, doing something like continuous integration, continuous delivery, et cetera. So the first benefit is really moving testing up front. So we talk about how a typical process where you have testing coming late in the cycle. Anytime that coding runs longer than expected, which we know can happen very frequently, what's going to happen is that we're going to compress the amount of time that we have available to test, or we're going to need to push out our release date in order to do the amount of testing that we feel is necessary to go live into production with our new software. So when we do TDD and we bring testing up front and we write the automated test up front, what that does is really allows us to remove that risk of running over. While the code could still take longer to develop than usual, as long as we have the test up front, we might be late on the release date, but at least we're being late because the code is going over and there's visibility into that, and that the coding process is taking longer than expected, and we're not dumping that responsibility over on the testers to try to do their job in less time. So it should really help to eliminate a lot of friction in between the test and development teams that exists a lot, where testers aren't huge fans of developers because they're giving them code late and then they're rushing to have to do their job. So there's certainly some benefits to the organization there. I think we all know this, but in general, when you find defects later on, they cost a lot more to fix. So when you can find defects up front, they're very cheap to fix. The later on that you find them, the more difficult it is to fix them and the more that it costs. So if we can have test-driven development help to have developers find defects the first time, right as they're implementing the code, they'll be much cheaper to fix, and they should be able to be fixed much more quickly because the developer is seeing the problem right then while they're still in the code. They don't need to remember what they were doing and go pull down that code, try to find the error, etc. It's much more instant feedback, and so that should really eliminate a lot of the unnecessary costs of fixing defects. A lot of those costs are when we sort of push the rigorous testing out till the last minute when we're in sort of that pre-production or staging environment, and that can cause us to have to roll back a lot of changes in order to fix that bug, which obviously comes with a lot of cost. In terms of baking in automation up front, a lot of times that, when we're building code, we build automation after the code is actually developed or even deployed, and that has a lot of limitations, right? So we can't do anything about what we have in the code. We can't say, oh, we want to test this a certain way, so we're going to add this API, or we're going to, build in this ability to kind of diagnose what the problem is here. We kind of have to work with what we get, right? So there's not as much that we can do to help make the software itself more testable, so that limits what we can do from our testing approach. The UI-driven tests in particular that people like to build are typically a lot slower because you're waiting for pages to render and to load and for objects to show up. And also they're more brittle because anytime objects move around, there's a risk that you're not using the right name for that object, or you have it based off of some particular criteria that is no longer valid, and the test breaks and shows as a failure even though there's no problem with the code. So those are all kind of false positives that we need to go investigate, and maintenance we need to do on the scripts that is somewhat unnecessary. And then finally, a lot of times it takes a lot of effort to build these UI-driven tests, and so we have incomplete test coverage. We're basically taking taking into account where we have the most traffic and trying to build tests around that, but we're not getting complete coverage or as complete of coverage as we might like, because we have to be very strategic about where we can actually build tests. So moving to TDD really can allow you to bake in the automation up front, build better automation, build more testable software that has the thought in mind of the fact that this needs to have an automated test against it, and then that will really help to reduce costs and risk going forward, because we should have more complete automation coverage and we should be getting it from day one rather than having to wait for that to get delivered down the line. So in terms of building for testability, you'll see that a lot of the problem that we have, if we look at a piece of software as a bunch of different puzzle pieces being put together to comprise it, when we do testing in a real system and we try to do some of this UI testing, more integration testing and system testing that a lot of people are doing around automation, what happens is that we have to have all sort of these components of the system hooked in together and running to be able to execute these tests. So it really means that there's a lot of dependencies in how we push code, and things need to be kind of set up together in an environment for us to be able to do the testing properly. But when we move towards more unit testing, and the developers help us in implementing, mock objects and things of the like that help to sort of fake what some other parts of the system are doing and make the system easier to test in small pieces, what we can do is change one piece of the system, kind of impersonate what the other parts of the system would do and how they would interact with that small piece, and then be able to test just that piece instead of having to wait on all the other parts to be ready to be able to push the software. So what that does is really frees up us and allows us to have more of a DevOps or continuous deployment type of approach, where we might push one feature while another one is getting developed without having to worry about sort of the interactions and interdependencies there. So this is a big one. I know this is somewhat basic to many people, but for others it may be the first time seeing this. So there's really a thought around the test pyramid, and this is something that I cannot in any way take credit for, but the test pyramid really consists of how you build your test strategy, how many unit tests you have, how many more integration or service level tests you have, and then how many UI tests that you have in your particular system. So, in many organizations, we see that the UI tests are making up a majority of the tests that people are performing. And those are obviously slow, brittle tests. They take a long time to build. There's a lot of maintenance to maintaining those, and so that can hold people back from getting good automation coverage and being able to shift towards TDD. So shifting towards TDD approach, whether that's more unit-focused or more of an ATDD or a BDD approach, should help to round out the pyramid and kind of push people to drive towards fewer UI tests and more unit tests and integration tests in their strategy. And that makes for much more scalable automation that can be run more quickly in more of a DevOps type of environment. Finally, we're talking here about what TDD will allow you to do when paired with something that's more of a DevOps type of deployment approach. So in the old way, we saw that you would code one feature, it might be ready, and then you're coding another feature, and what you end up doing is waiting until all of the features in a particular sprint or a particular release are done, so that you can build them all into one environment, test them all, and then deploy them out. And so you have to wait for all features to be done before you can get paid, in terms of having your users actually get those new features and drive new revenue and adoption and all of that. So in the new way, if you're writing all of the tests up front as part of TDD, and then you're developing the features along the way, when you have DevOps on the back end and the ability to deploy very quickly within minutes or hours or days, whatever it is, what it allows you to do is, since you've already done the testing, and you can do that in kind of more of a contained environment doing DevOps, you can actually push those features out into production as soon as they're ready, which might in many ways get a lot more value from you to your customer more quickly. So that's certainly something to consider as a benefit of TDD approaches paired with some sort of DevOps type of deployment approach. So we would love to know, and very curious always to know, how often people are actually deploying their software, and sort of the second half of TDD fully realized, in my opinion, is doing something like DevOps, where you might be deploying daily or even more frequently than that if possible. So if you guys could take a second here and fill out the survey, we've got options from daily or even more frequent than daily deployments up to yearly deployment here, and we're interested to know really what's the prevalence of these very frequent deployments across you guys, and if not, we definitely are interested in wondering why people are not deploying more frequently. We know there's a lot of challenges around that, obviously, with trying to deliver on the software and regulatory compliance and those types of things. So we're always interested to find out more as well. So let's see here. Looks like most frequently is quarterly. So looks like a lot of people are still kind of in that quarterly cadence, maybe a monthly cadence. Those two together definitely takes up the majority there. But some people are doing daily or more frequent deployments. So we definitely see, just as TDD is kind of a new thing as far as how we define the software and test the software, DevOps, while everyone talks about it, is still kind of a new thing in terms of how people are actually deploying software out to their customers. All right, so this final section here that we're going to talk about before we get into Q&A is really about how to make the shift to TDD. So, it's great to learn about this and see all the great benefits, but obviously if you don't know how to make this shift over there, you're never going to be able to realize any of the great benefits that we talked about. So in my experience, really the best way to look at making a successful change here is to really look at people, process, and technology. So those are the three big buckets when we make changes inside a development organization that I think need to be investigated and considered. And one thing as well, you'll see on the outside there, I like this diagram. It really talks about kind of the continuous improvement cycle. So you're constantly kind of improving things, seeing how they're going, investigating or troubleshooting, fixing those issues, and kind of in a constant process. So it's a lot like, in many ways, like a diet. It's not, you can't make an overnight change and do one thing and then be TDD and forget about it, or do DevOps and forget about it. It's a constant cycle of improving what you're doing and trying to be better, and that's definitely the Agile mantra as well. So as far as the first area that we'll investigate here, the people, we think, people is really the biggest driver, I think. Where you see successful TDD initiatives, it's typically because somebody is either really experienced in this area and has a lot of knowledge and confidence in delivering that, or they're just a very much so a strong leader who is able to build some confidence within their team about taking on this new approach and taking risks. So really the three areas we see are oftentimes an automation talent gap, a culture around really just delivering features and throughput, and then finally sort of a communication that's very siloed as far as talking between departments. So one is the automation competence. I mean, a lot of organizations, they have either no automation competence in-house, or it's all focused around more legacy tools that you typically wouldn't see paired with TDD or BDD. So really we see kind of three approaches that you can take to fix that. One is that you can train up your existing team, and that obviously takes time, but it's a lower cost, and it's scalable because then your team will be transformed. So that's kind of the approach you can take if you don't need to have TDD tomorrow. You can also hire in. We see that's a good kind of middle ground. You can get someone in today who might be able to jumpstart TDD on one or two of your teams, but it will cost you. You got to hire new people, and then you got to wait for them to kind of get around in the organization to everyone and teach them how these new automation tools and strategies would work. And then the third way is that you could just outsource it entirely, and that's obviously the biggest cost, but that might be what you need to do if you feel that you need to have a TDD type of development approach right away, and that you don't have the people inside your organization to do that. But it's really not scalable. We see a lot of people that take that approach, and it's a good approach where needed, but it's definitely not the best approach for long-term building that competence internally in an organization. The second problem we see is around this feature-centric culture. So a lot of developers just, are constantly just spending their time writing feature code, and they're, it's not their fault. They're constantly rewarded, recognized, paid for the number of features and story points and things that they can deliver. But there's a need to shift that culture, maybe shift the incentives, and shift your rewards and how you develop your employees around more of a balanced approach, right? So when you move to TDD, really it's a three-part process, one part of which is just writing the feature code, but they've also be able to write good tests and need to be able to refactor their code as well as they're going along and doing this red-green refactor cycle. So that's certainly a shift that needs to happen. A lot of developers, think that testing is not important. Not all do. Certainly there are a lot that do value testing, but some really aren't sold on the value there. So that is certainly a shift that you would need to take to really embrace the TDD approach and make sure that you have a culture that aligns with that particular process. And then finally, as it relates to people, we talk about the three AMIGOS, and so that's really an approach that's kind of the term that people use around a business analyst, a developer, and a tester getting in one room together and defining a set of tests that would be the basis or sort of the requirement for developing the code. And so proper BDD in particular is implemented when you have the collaboration between those three people. So this isn't as relevant to unit testing type of TDD, but definitely for behavior-driven development, it's going to be imperative that those three people can, if they can't get in a room together, at least get on some sort of chat platform together to really work through these things in real time to really fully realize the benefits of this particular approach. So that's the three key areas that we picked out in relation to people. In relation to process, obviously people change process all the time. It can go well, sometimes it goes poorly, but we really think that it's worth thinking about what process you want up front. People are always skeptical of process change when it's happening very frequently and it's not really a long-term process that's being established. So we definitely think that you should focus on three areas. One is, how are you really going to define the quote-unquote requirements, which in this case now are going to be more of tests that you're requiring the developers to put together and testers to put together to actually define the software. The second is how you can put in checks to make sure that tests are written before code is, because that's where the process can really break apart when developers put off writing the tests and actually go ahead with just writing the code first and say that they'll go develop the test later. Obviously, it's test-driven development, so that's not really the goal of the process in any way. And then the third is this frequent refactoring. So how can you get developers to go back and have time and think about how they can make their solution more elegant? That's obviously one of the big benefits of putting in this approach, is the ability to refactor your code very easily and make a more and more scalable and high-performing solution, but you need to obviously implement time in your process to do that as well. So you can see here when we look at kind of a BDD and also many ATDD requirements or tests, they're written in more of a given when then format. So you see here the specification is a sample feature and scenario that would be in a gherkin format that's used by Cucumber. And you can see here that, especially in this bottom part here where the scenario is getting defined, this is a much different type of language than we would see in more traditional waterfall specifically requirements. So this will be a big mindset change. This may have ripple impacts, to different stakeholders that need to see requirements, right? We've got to get buy-in from customers that they're willing to look at this type of format, from different people on the business side that they're willing to look at requirements this way, and change from what is typically a much more bloated or much more wordy type of requirement that has been coming out of more of the traditional RUP or waterfall type of model. The second consideration is sort of around forcing developers to write tests before code. And so this is not like an easy one, and I can't say, well, here's the answer, to getting developers to do that. It obviously takes time. A lot of times it takes them seeing the benefit of having these unit tests that they can run very quickly and identify problems right away as they create them. But a lot of developers will really have a lot of friction or get very annoyed about having to do this. That's why I put the picture there. So you may need to guard against this and realize that there's going to be some pushback here and that that's natural. But the goal is to kind of get this in place and kind of push the process, and they're going to have some trust that there is a benefit coming to them, that having these unit tests will ultimately make their job easier and should allow them to focus more time on building new features and testing new features rather than having to go back and spend a lot of time trying to find these bugs that are popping up later, whether that be in production or in later testing cycles. And then finally, we talk here about the focus on refactoring. So refactoring is a big piece of the puzzle here. A lot of organizations today don't do anything to refactor their solutions and refactor their software. So this is a big part and a big benefit of TDD is that once you build tests, that you do give the developer an option to go back and make their solution more elegant while still passing the code. So it's kind of a shift in where people spend their time. A lot of times today, developers would say, well, if I have an extra 20 minutes, I'm going to add these 3 bells and whistles onto this feature that might be nice to have and not really defining that requirement. So now it's shifting their focus and saying, hey, if you have an extra 20 minutes or an hour, you should focus that on how can you make the solution even more robust, even more slick, so that it's not going to break in the future, and that our basis of our software is very stable, and we have a lot of faith in it running well in the future. And then the final section here that we're going to talk about is technology-related changes. I know there's plenty of webinars out on the web that you can look at both in the past and coming up in the future around different automation frameworks and how to choose one that best fits your BDD or ATDD process. We've really tried to just hit on the high points here in terms of what technology changes would come with doing a more test-driven approach. So the first one is definitely around selecting an automation framework, and you'll find several forums and blog posts and things about people saying that there's a new test-driven development framework that's the best thing since sliced bread. And a lot of people struggle with this and really get caught up on it, and I think it's important to make the right choice, but I think a lot of people spend too much time and get too caught up in trying to pick the right framework. We see a lot of organizations that have success doing BDD, and they're using 5 or 10 different frameworks inside the organization. So there's definitely no need to force that requirement of picking one perfect framework up front. You can always, use several and make different choices as you go along and switch. One is definitely, around the development style. Some frameworks tend to cater more towards BDD, others obviously more unit testing. Some claim that they're specific to acceptance, test-driven development. So that's one consideration to make. Another one is scalability. So a lot of the frameworks are better for smaller teams and allow you to work quickly. Other ones are better for larger organizations, have more robust workflows, ability to identify where tests are being reused, and you might be able to reuse existing assets. So that's something to look at. There's a workflow aspect to it as well. There's a lot of variance, especially with Cucumber, for example, where the tests will be linked directly to a user story, or the scenarios will be directly linked to a user story rather than to a feature, and some people prefer that. So that's one aspect to look at. And then finally, I think the biggest one is the language. So a lot of people will want to get a Java-specific BDD framework so that their Java developers can contribute to the BDD code, whereas other organizations might want to get something written in Ruby or Python so that they could easily train their developers up on how to use that particular BDD tool and then have them to contribute to the automation. So a lot of choices to make there, and certainly can't do it justice in the little time that we're spending on this here. But we did want to go ahead and ask you guys if any of you guys are actually using a test automation framework, either a BDD, ATDD, or TDD test automation framework today to help with your automation testing. And so these would be specifically things like Cucumber, JBehave, JUnit, NUnit, SpecFlow, Spock, things of that nature. So we'll give you another few seconds here. So it looks like a lot of people are using these frameworks, a little less than half, but still the majority is not yet using one. So we do acknowledge it's a big decision to make, but it's certainly one you should be able to find a lot of information about, and my personal philosophy is not to overthink that too much. And so for the people who answered yes to using the framework, we would love if you could just drop us, a quick description here about is this a custom framework that you're using to do your BDD, ATDD, et cetera, or is it something like Cucumber? Is it something like JBehave, Spock, et cetera? Just a quick note here would be great, just so that we're aware of what you guys are using and we can better put out content in the future to fit those needs. Awesome. So there's just two more slides here really before we're through to the end. So basically moving to BDD process, we think will really make you have more testable software. Hopefully you'll build more APIs, mock objects, things of that nature, test databases that can help you to write more automated tests that are interacting down here in the middle at more of this API integration or component level, rather than focusing specifically on the GUI tests up at the top there. So we were showing the pyramid earlier. This is another version of the pyramid here, and you can see that, very specifically here, there's a big chunk and a big layer of tests that should be built around APIs and components and things like that need to be accessible to the test automation framework, and not every team really has built their software in that way. So hopefully moving to TDD will push you in this way, which we think generally is a good thing and best practice in software development. And then finally here, I think monitoring is a big consideration to make when moving to TDD or BDD. There's a lot of risk as you start the process that you might have some bugs leak through as you're trying to learn how to write good unit tests and get them done on time. So I think it's worth monitoring your solution, making sure you have that put in place before you make a shift to this process, especially if you're doing very continuous deployment out to your customers, to make sure if anything does go wrong that you have the ability to find out about that, and then ideally the ability to either roll that change back or to fix it very quickly. And that provides you a little bit of a safety net in case something goes wrong as you're getting spun up on the process. So that's definitely something to consider as well. So all that being said, we do want to spend some time here answering your questions. We definitely thank you for your time today. I'm going to let Jeff start to pick out some questions from the list. If you have any that you want to ask me personally, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to connect. And also you can tweet at me. I know a number of you have already during the course of the webinar, but if you want to keep the conversation alive there, feel free to do that as well.
Great. Yeah, really good stuff, Kevin. We got a lot of questions in. One of the questions we got in is, can I get the slides? Will this be available on demand? The answer is yes. You will get an email after the webinar with the on-demand replay, so don't worry, you will get that in the next day or so. And the slides will be up on the QASymphony SlideShare page, so just check SlideShare and you should be able to download those slides from there. Okay, so Kevin, let's go to we're going to actually go back to slide 28. And I think this is a clarification question on unit tests and UI tests and the way they appear in this slide.
Yeah, I noticed that when we were talking about it. So on the pyramid on the right, that top triangle should say UI test. So that was it should stay the same, in terms of the order of them on the left and the right. That one on the top should be UI test.
Yeah. Okay. We actually had like 10 people ask that question.
Okay.
So they're very engaged, right? It's good to see people are engaged and picking up on typos in the slides. The next question comes in. It is, so will TDD increase the demand of automation testers in the team?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general it should. Either there's two concepts. One of more of a increase in the automation engineers and having standalone automation engineers, and then a lot of teams are moving to kind of combination of people who can both develop code and develop automation. So those are two trends we see. Either we're going to have dedicated automation engineers and we need to have more of them, or we're going to have everyone on the team be kind of a flex player, which is a little bit rarer to see, but some places like Microsoft, I know, for example, is big about software developers that also have deep testing skills. So there's a chance for testers to even go beyond just being an automated tester and become somewhat of a developer as well.
Okay, another good question here. If developers build the tests, then what is the role of the tester in BDD?
Yeah, so if developers help to actually, write the test, I think a lot of what testers are becoming is like really a champion for quality. So they may, inside of a Scrum team, for example, since Scrum and TDD are things that can be complementary, they're not contradictory. We might see that the tester becomes the voice of quality on that team. The tester might be the one who really kind of comes up with all the particular test scenarios and helps to define what they should do, and then the developer or automation engineer actually writes those scenarios. And a lot of times we see that testers now are also focusing a lot on sort of the project management angle. They're getting involved in being the Scrum Master, for example, for a particular Scrum team. And sometimes they're even sort of getting involved in the customer success side as well. So testers are becoming a voice of the customer. They're understanding bugs and issues that customers are having, so that they can bring that knowledge onto the team and educate the team on how people actually use the software when they go to build new features.
Great. This is a great question from Steve from Manhattan Associates. One of the big issues QA organizations face is the resistance of stubborn development teams. Can you review one more? Can you suggest ways to change the culture between QA and development?
Yeah, I think that's that's always a tricky one. I think as much as possible that we can work on smaller teams. I think it's better. I mean, I think when we have this kind of faction type approach in organizations where we have a huge testing team and a huge development team, there's always going to be kind of war and tension between the two. So the more that we can break up into smaller teams, and I think you get to work with the same person and really understand them and have some general empathy for them and what they're doing in their daily job, I think the better communication becomes. And so I think BDD is a great way to really enforce this. Obviously, there'll be a lot of friction off the beginning, getting a developer and a tester and a BA to all sit maybe at the same pod or the same table together for 8 hours a day. But once you actually get that process going, I think it's pretty quick. It's like people being in a life raft together. They have to kind of learn to get by together, and that's obviously good for the organization as a whole.
Okay, next question. How will TDD improve confidence that the customer requirements are tested and delivered?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think in general it's all about how it's implemented, right? So a lot of people would have problem today with meeting their requirements and making sure that their customers are happy, and they think that there's going to be a silver bullet solution to implement TDD and be able to fix all the current problems that they're having. And if you don't have a good feedback loop from your customers and you don't have good engagement from your customers on what they really want, good visibility there, TDD is not going to solve much. And if your business analysts don't really understand what your customers want, and there's a gap there as well, that's, this process is not going to solve that problem on its own. But what it can do is really force the issue of collaboration and thought about how things should be up front, which I think is always beneficial. It's obviously a little bit of a mindset change to start having these considerations up front rather than, at the last minute. But that's the benefit it can bring, but it alone won't fix all your problems, for sure.
Great. Next question. When using BDD, ATDD, are testers required to understand the code to ensure the right coverage?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I mean, I certainly think that it's helpful, but not necessarily required. So in many ways, developer and the tester can kind of think about code coverage on more of a component basis and really think of it, by feature and kind of by interface and things like that. The testers have more of a functional knowledge of, but I certainly think it's helpful for a tester to understand the code. I mean, I think just in general, even if you're not going to do TDD or BDD or ATDD, I think that's one of the major things where testers can elevate their value in the organization and also be able to have more honest conversations with developers is when they can really understand to some degree what's going on. Obviously, they're not maybe going to be a developer and have that level of competence, but regardless, I think it's helpful for testers to have that skill.
Great. All right, last question because we're up against the hour. Can you provide an example of how TDD can provide more testable software?
Yeah, that's a good one. So, for example, like if you're in an organization today and you're doing UI tests and you want to shift to TDD, you might then need to build an API, for example, that would allow you to create a new customer without having to go through your typical customer enrollment process, so that you have a more robust test that doesn't need to interact with the UI, can be run more quickly, can be run many times in parallel, etc. And that's because you're making check-ins very frequently, so you need to run tests very frequently, and you care about how long they take to run. So that would force you to create, if you didn't have one before, a login API that these tests can interact with to do that function. And so you can see over the course of time, running into those issues, you create more and more APIs and potentially mock objects and things to test your software, and overall that allows you to have a lot more different types of tests that you can run against and even build your software in better ways, move towards more of a microservices architecture if you're familiar with that.
Great, great. Well, Kevin, thanks for your time. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the webinar in just a few seconds. Remember to take the survey that's going to pop up. Just give us some feedback, and we hope to see you on an upcoming webinar in March and hopefully at our conference in April. Take care.